And in fact, if you look at the Big Push initiative, the total number of road projects involved, Winston, we did a counting, and it's about 45 projects so far. And the president says that no contract will last for more than 24 months. So it means that no contract will last for more than 2 years. And you told me something that, well, if you look at this Big Push initiative, there's something unique about it in terms of the funding. What do we know?
It's interesting to know that we have countless projects to the extent that in 2022, the initial government, the previous government decided to go on a year of roads. And we saw a lot of announcement, year of roads all over the country. And the initiative then was to ensure that key structures, the key cities are connected. And that was the whole approach because of their initial plan of one district, one factory.
Yeah.
So it was quite critical to assess that it gave reason to ensure that we need to connect these factories to the marketplaces to ensure the supply of goods and access to the market. All of these were taken into consideration. So coming into light with the launch of this Big Push, it's important that the government decide to have a sustainable funding. First of all, we've been cut off from the international market. That is a key concern. Access to funding becomes a key issue. But one thing that we are lucky about is that we've been blessed by oil, and therefore revenue from oil has been the reasoning behind this Big Push. So the government says they will be using oil revenue, royalties from oil, and some partnership from the private sector to champion this project. So they said within 24 months, some of the projects should be completed, and that is critical because the government says they've demarcated the project into structures. So you don't have a whole contractor doing a whole kilometers, but they've been broken down to ensure there are continuity to sectors. And one interesting aspect that he made mention, which is a key concern for several projects, is the fact that we keep seeing projects not meeting deadlines.
Yeah.
We keep seeing projects not meeting timelines. There have been several projects that have spanned 8 years within a government's tenure, and it's a key concern considering the quality of materials. So you go to projects, you realize that refurbishment and rehabilitation is thrice the original budgeted amount on some projects. For instance, we can use the flyover around the Shiashi interchange, and that was also a key consideration. And there are some key projects that over the years, if you go now to say you're going to bring materials back to site, and all those becomes a key consideration, you go to project analysis. At the end of the day, by then, material prices have gone higher, and it's going to cost the contractor much more. And therefore, that is why you keep seeing some prices on projects bloating or going higher before the end of that project is executed.
Well, I mean, we've analyzed I've been talking about some 45 road projects that will be constructed so far. 32 of them will fairly be new projects. 13 will be abandoned projects, according to the president or the finance minister in the budget. And 4 will be projects at various stages of completion. But I mean, the most important thing that we've spoken about and all of us have been talking about is the cost involved. The government says that they will need about 10 billion US dollars to complete the Big Push initiative. I mean, Winston has spoken about the source of funding, but let's break it down more in terms of how sustainable this can be. We've seen the year of roads and all of that, but this looks like it's one project that has dedicated funding. So especially for those projects that were bilateral arrangements and they had to be, halted because of the DDE program.
So before this current policy on the year of roads, most of the road projects were actually funded through oil reserves, so our oil revenues. So a part of the budget is funded through the ABFA, and the ABFA comes from 70% of our total oil revenues. The other 30% goes to GMPC and some investment holdings. So the 70% before this new policy was demarcated. So about 70% of that 70%, so more than half of the 70% coming to the budget goes to roads. Then the other one goes to free SHS. That's why free SHS was funded through our oil revenues. They also have some on healthcare and then some other ones. And then PIAC, the Public Interest Accountability Committee. So all of these were part of the ABFA prior to this. Now, when the new administration came, they decided that, okay, instead of the 70% of our oil revenues being split across different priority areas, let's give the entire thing and the entire amount to roads. So now the entire 70% from our oil revenues are going towards roads. And then, so this is a marginal increment, but it's still an increment.
Yeah.
So before this, even though, we keep saying that there were no dedicated source of funding for roads, there actually was. So now the only problem is with the execution. So once we have a source of funding coming from oil revenues, even though this is not the first time, the problem now is with the execution and then the releases. But also because if you're relying on your oil revenues, and not just oil, but our mineral royalties as well, if you're relying on these two main components, if you notice, most of them come from dollar-denominated, commodities. So if our Cedi performs very well, which it's doing now, you're not going to get as much revenue as you need to get, which is why some people were calling for an intentional depreciation of the currency. Because if you look through the media budgets, most of our revenues that were priced in dollars will miss the mark.
Yeah.
Because most of it, the Cedi appreciated sharply that government was not getting that revenue. So this is something that has to be taken into mind. And aside that as well, also, if you look at the trend, for the past 5 years, our oil production has been dropping. And once oil production drops, revenue from oil drops as well. So is this sustainable? It depends on two main factors.
Yeah.
Whether we can keep our oil production at par, if not even the same place, increase it every single year. And we know the president has signed some memorandums with some of the oil companies.
A year 9 core, right?
Exactly. So increasing oil production and then sustaining your currency. If your currency depreciates too rapidly, it affects the citizens, but you still get more revenue to do your roads. But if it appreciates too much, you're getting less revenue from that side. So managing the currency stability and also your production of oil to get more revenue is something that can't sustain this project.
Well, 13.9 billion is the target, and the president said close about 14 billion is what we are using for the Big Push initiative. But we've spoken about sustainability and where the money will come from. We've been looking at, especially if you look at the Big Push, budgetary allocation so far. This year, government is hoping to allocate some 13.9 billion. It is expected to go up as high as 21.22 billion Ghana cedis by 2028 when the president leaves office. But we've also been trying to understand the makeup of, where this money is going to come from. And I'll ask you a question about sustainability. I mean, if you look at this, pie chart, what you realize is that the biggest components of the amount for the Big Push initiative or funding for Big Push is expected to come from the annual budget fund amount, right? And about 35% is expected to come from mineral royalties. In here, mineral royalties, the biggest component definitely will be gold. There are concerns about illegal mining, right? And even spoken about gold board and its sustainability and all of that. And Caleb made a good point that if you look at the ABFA, for instance, the amount that comes in depends on your oil production. All of these two sources are subject to seasonal changes and your ability to produce more, right? I mean, is this likely to affect, the Big Push initiative in terms of its funding source and how much comes in every year?
One would say make hay while the sun shines. It appears all these elements that we're depending upon at this point in time, they are all making good strides on the international market. So if government is not able to capitalize this now, we can't tell what will come tomorrow based on projections. Economists can't just consider factors being made available to them currently. The city is looking good. The oil prices are looking good. Cocoa prices also looking good. And it's high time that certainly we've been mining for. We did an assessment here for over 15 years.
Yeah.
As a country, what can we say we've done with oil revenue? Ghanaians will say it's high time the road close to my house is being constructed. Every day we spend so much in traffic, buying for consistently, cars being spent. So you look at the lifespan of Ghanaians every day, traveling from the north to the south, the number of hours you spend, food products spent on the roads. So it makes kind of reasonable for us to say if we want to go on the path of industrialization, it's quite essential that that path is tarred. And tarring that path will cost us this oil revenue. It is oil flowing, and one thing that was quite important was that just recently some oil firms in the country, even GNPC, have projected that next year they are going to start some exploration.
Yeah.
So it gives some form of positive optimism in the oil sector, telling you that indeed there are avenues that will come on stream. Going by that path, you mentioned one critical point, royalties from gold. The environmental consequences on all this reflect to the by effect of our actions, not just chasing revenue, but let's be considerate about its ripple effect on the environment. Already, Ghana Water Company has been the first people to crack the whip. Let's not forget the hospitals we can say a time will come where we'll not be having the qualification or let's say the equipment, and not necessarily the human factor, but the infrastructure to uphold the number of patients that will report cases of waterborne diseases as a result of illegal operations close to our water body. So these are all by effect or social impact of our action, not just focusing on the revenue, but on our lives. So if you want to improve our livelihood, let's not do that to the detriment of our economy as well. So indeed, the capex has been budgeted for 2025. It is likely to increase by 32.7 billion Ghana cedis, and this is a big cake. But how to demarcate it should be done cautiously.
Well, based on this, big number on the smarts, we'll have some figures on my white sheet, and I would like to run it through with Caleb. Winston has made mention of this 32.7 billion Ghana cedis. That is the total amount we are allocating for capital expenditure in 2025. In fact, if you look at this capital expenditure, about 64% in terms of its funding is expected to come from domestic sources, right? Big push is a big deal in there. External sources about 35.8%, or you can say 36%. But I'm looking at credibility in terms of, does this government have the will to go ahead with a big push initiative, especially looking at the fact that almost all the funding is expected to come from, government sources? Because I'm looking at the first half of the year data. And what I can see is that the projection was that if you look at this capital expenditure, by the time we are done with the first half of the year, we should spend about 55% of this amount of money that was budgeted for. But per what I'm looking at right now, instead of the 18.1 billion Ghana cedis we budgeted for the first half of 2025, we've only spent about 7.1, or we've only released about 7.1 billion, Ghana cedis. That's just about 39% of the amount budgeted for capital expenditure. Let me go to the big push, proper, where the first half of the year, the idea or the estimation was that government was expected to release some 5.1 billion Ghana cedis for big push. But based on the data that the finance minister provided us in the media budget, what we understand is that just about 3.9 billion Ghana cedis has been expended so far. The president made a good explanation yesterday saying that, well, we spent about 4 billion. We want to spend more, about 9 billion this year, but we are looking at assessment. We are assessing some of the roads. That's why we've not gone ahead with the payment. But we know what is happening in free SHS, where huge sums of money is budgeted, but when it comes to releases, it's always a challenge. So do you think that, we are overestimating how much we can even spend on big push, looking at how far we've come in terms of our historical antecedent with budgetary releases?
And that's the main problem, because always we allocate resources, say we'll fund this, we'll do this. But then at the end of the year, these projects don't get the required funding. And then it stalls, and then at the next 2 or 3 years, the price of that project will quadruple. And then you're looking for more funds to come and complete just road out, should have cost less than that. So that's a big problem. But then the justification from the government was that in the first half of the year, they were still vetting some of these contractors, and then trying to make sure that the claims were accurate before they release funds. So that was the justification from the roads minister earlier this year as to why the government did not release funding into the big push and the other capital expenditure. But then following, at the end of the year, we are supposed to see that the entire, 20-something billion should be expended, because, like we already said, capital expenditure, and not just roads, but then hospitals, Agenda 111, all those things are the source of, an economy. If you don't have these things, your economy cannot progress. So expending is very important. But then the problem also is that sometimes we allocate, but then the revenue doesn't come to government for government to be able to spend. And if you look at the trend of crude oil prices, since last year they've been coming down. Even though this year we've seen some marginal uptick, the trend is downwards. So
you're finding it difficult to return to the 80s and the 70s
exactly.
US dollars per barrel. It has been
below 70 for a very long time now. Even after the Israel-Iran conflict, it went up a bit, but it's still subdued because of some geopolitics involved. So with this trajectory, unless we significantly increase our oil production, revenues will be subdued. And once revenues are low, you cannot allocate the entire expenditure you've allocated. But then another important thing is that when the budget was being drawn, the cedi was trading to the dollar at a certain exchange rate. And then also oil revenues, oil prices were actually very high in January, around $70 per barrel. So if you are doing projections based on $70 per barrel and then 15 cedis to $1, it means that you're expecting huge revenue from your oil production. But then once you're in the middle of the year now, we see oil prices being very low, and we also see that the cedi has done very well. It means that your revenue coming from oil production is going to go down, which could be why the government cannot spend what it promised to spend at the beginning of the year, because they're not realizing that revenue. And if you look through the media budget, you can see that all our revenues that are dollar denominated were below the mark because of cedi appreciation, which is why it's a big problem, and which is why no government wants to say this, but your cedi cannot appreciate too much.
Yeah, you always have to find a balance, and that was the point of the president, that finding that balance is very important. But definitely, if out of your 32.7 billion capital expenditure, about 42% is expected to go to roads, what is the opportunity cost?
That's a very deliberate question, and that is a question that can only be answered in the course of execution. And let's not forget that we've not budgeted the element of corruption in this way of numbers, because we understand over the years one of the key sectors that have faced challenges is the road sector. Contractors usually are being owed by government, and their monies are locked over the years, appreciating, and even at the end of the day, they are paid less, and we get to see underdealings subsequently in the operations, and that has been a development. I've spoken countlessly with the Association of Construction, and they say that they are the builders of the economy, and their consideration is critical in this planning stage. Right now, that sector will be thriving. The key consideration is this: in as much as we need rules, let's not desperately go for projects that subsequently you get to see that they'll give a good number, but the key elements are hidden in the rehabilitation sector. So consistently, they keep charging higher rehabilitation accumulatively over the years, and you realize that the qualities are subdued. So we have roads that have been tarred for more than 10 years now, the same road. You wonder whether the roads, is it going to lead you to heaven? And that is constant targeting. But the case is how we are spending on a particular roads, because they are all of us are aware, during election periods, you wake up the next day, you don't know where the tractors came from, but the roads are tarred.
Even Akwitia, they were construction.
Exactly, even what we saw in Akwitia. All these are elements. Let's not just be throwing monies away. We need quality roads that can endure the standard, the weather, the nature of cars in the road, and the types of vehicles that are supposed to ply the roads. There are certain roads that have been destroyed because of the huge vehicles that ply on them. All these should be taken into consideration, depending on the quality of execution that has to be done, and the quality of the contractors, whether they have the competence. The president said something very interesting. He says they're going to use technology to monitor the performances of those.
He said there will be no wheelbarrow contractors this time around, right?
Exactly. And he said that based on the fact that these contractors are going to be given to huge companies that are going to use high quality materials. But we still need to assess, would they meet the deadline? Because I was at a meeting when the Kokwase in Sawan project began, and I was speaking to the contractor somewhere last year, and that project was supposed to finish last year, June. I was sitting there when they did the presentation, excellent presentation. Last year, June, that's when the project was supposed to complete, but we are still in 2025, and the project hasn't still been completed until subsequent government gives it to pass. So you wonder, what are the challenges? Let's not forget that although this may be the budgeted amount, there are key considerations that may come, extra costs that may come as a result of execution. Sometimes there may be disputes over landed area, compensation for affected demolition exercise around those areas. Even sometimes building of a bridge over water bodies, there has to be compensation to the fetish priests in those areas. All these are unforeseen or less unplanned expenditure that come as a result of, although we've budgeted, but the actual may change and may be higher than this.
And even your currency, if your currency depreciates massively between just a few months after you awarded the contract, the same estimation cannot be taken throughout the life of the contract.
Absolutely.
Well, there are many who are saying that, in fact, make sure that the big push doesn't become a big burden on banks. I see what you're where doing. They will rather end up compiling or hiking banks' non-performing loans, because we understand, we know there are two sectors that actually causes banks cause banks to actually have high non-performing loans. The energy sector is number one, IPPs, late payments from government, and then also road contractors. This is a big push. But in fact, if you are not very strategic in terms of the funding and the releases, you end up creating a big burden on commercial banks, because definitely, I'm not sure there will be any contractor that will start the project and they will give him 100% of the money. They would have to find ways and means to fund that project, get that money from government to pay back, their loans and all of that. So the question is, how do we ensure that this big push initiative, which is supposed to push the 24-hour economy agenda, doesn't become a burden on commercial banks?
It's all about the funding source. If you have a dedicated funding source that's reliable, you can meet the obligation. But then the problem, like we've already said, the problem is that the source of the revenue for these projects are based on things that sometimes the government or the country cannot control. Your exchange rates, the price of crude on the market, and also the production of your mineral, of your oil and gold. So these are the things that you cannot control.
Yeah.
But then the government can take steps to ensure that oil production stays the way it is or goes up. It can make sure that gold production, even though there are issues that Gold Board is buying gold from illegal miners, that's something that needs to be addressed. And if once that is addressed as well, you will see that the revenue gotten from Gold Board will reduce. Because like the president admitted, Gold Board is being sponsored partly by illegal miners. So once that happens, we are going to see a reduction in inflows from Gold Board. Once that happens as well, you see that the revenue you are getting from your mineral royalties will come down. And also, with the mineral royalties, we have to be very strategic, because most of these mining areas, they're always complaining that they are mining here for decades before independence, but we've not seen anything tangible in our areas. That's why we take mineral royalties. We take it from the producers of gold and all of that, so that the governments will reinvest it in the communities. Build schools for them, build roads, build hospitals for them. But most of these host communities complain that they don't see the benefits of mining, actual mining. And that's why sometimes people even go into illegal mining, because the actual mining, we are not seeing benefits. My economic condition hasn't changed. So let me just go into illegal mining and get my money and do it for myself. So these are all things that the government has to take into consideration. And then once your funding source is, reliable and releases are on time, there shouldn't be a problem. But also, also another key aspect is that if the government needs money in a certain area, most time government just redirects funds. So would this happen in this case? Would the government be redirecting the funds from the oil revenues into other sectors, or is going to make sure that it's going to be dedicated for our roads? That's also something we have to take into account.
A big opportunity for banks, or possibly a burden?
Certainly, a big push would demand a big pull. So certainly, the banks need to restructure their style of their debt outlook and assess risks possibly. So there has to be strong risk assessment. And just as they give loans to SMEs, the same standard should not be the same way they give loans to these contractors, because these are long-term returns. If you look at the nature of SMEs, they can bring it anytime soon once they make their profit. But for construction, it's still going to be a risk that they need to assess and ensure that they really ensure they reduce the non-performing loans faster. Because although they bag it together and target negatively, it shouldn't be all sectors. So sector by sector specific risk assessment is critical at this point. But we've seen this before, and we hope we don't repeat it again. That is why it's important for us to ensure there's more research done to ensure and more evaluation, consistent reporting. And at the end of the day, we hope that this will be fruitful.
Well, if you're asking the question, the president says that the Big Push initiative, in fact, that's about 13.9 billion Ghana cedis for just 2025 this year. And if you are looking at the long-term plan, we have seen the budgetary allocation so far, and it will be 13.9 this year. It is expected to rise to as high as 21.22 billion Ghana cedis by 2028, by the time the president leaves office. If you're asking about where would the money come from, the president or the finance ministry says that, well, we are going to use our mineral royalties, as well as the annual budget fund amount, a component of that, combine the two to do the Big Push initiative. Very, very, big amounts involved. But the president says that, well, we are going to finance this with domestic, revenue, and there should not be worry if you are a contractor. But we asked a very simple question: would this be a big burden on the banking sector, looking at their non-performing loan ratio. This has been Beyond the Numbers with me, Isaac Kofi. I did this with
Western Taki.
And as always,
Caleb Zebulon.
See you same time, 5:30 on Friday.